All right, so here's where we left off last time. We had talked about some ways to separate fuels from heat, for example, in terms of risk control for fire. Now we want to spend a little bit of time talking about limiting spread. And here we're talking both vertically and horizontally that we have to be thinking about this. There we go. This is what I need to see. Just make sure I'm in the camera there. There, much better. Look at that. It's almost like it's professional, except for 30 seconds of hesitating and messing around. Okay, so when we limit vertical fire spread, here's the thing about fire spreading up and down. Okay, you've got oxygen is feeding the fire. And so when you have stairwells and elevator shafts, big empty spaces that spread vertically, that's a means of bringing oxygen into your fire. It's actually fueling your fire. So any type of air duct, same thing, even a window or laundry or trash chutes, those are all empty spaces that are spreading your fire vertically. If you have storage of combustible materials that goes pretty high, you're spreading your fire vertically. So what can you do? Well, usually fire stops is what we're trying to do. So the trade-off is this. It's hard to have an unbroken open space. You want to break that up to prevent fire spread. And we can do that with the design of stairwells and how they go around. And sometimes it's frustrating. Sometimes if you want to go down the stairs 10 floors, you've got to do it on the left side of the building. And then if you want to go further, you're going to have to go to the right side of the building and then back and forth and back and forth. That has emergency evacuation implications too, though. So those are things you can think about. It's difficult to limit vertical fire spread in a building that's multi-story. That is a challenge. There's only so much you can do. Horizontal fire spread, there's a lot more that you can do. Anything solid is going to slow the spread of fire. So horizontally, what we're trying to think of is every so often we want to have a solid wall. And most of the time, even combustible materials that are filling up the space, as long as you don't have any open space, materials can contain a fire for an hour. And the idea is if you can contain it for an hour, most of the time that's going to give you enough time to put the fire out. Ideally we want an unbroken firewall that extends all the way from the ceiling, up past the ceiling, all the way down to the floor. Now, obviously, that's going to mean that you can't get from one side of the building to the other if you have that ideal in a wall. So more often, what you have is this unbroken wall with fire doors. So special doors that are trying to reduce the spread of fire. If it's not possible to do that, then the best you can probably do is water spray. That's what the bottom says. Water spray can help if these aren't possible. So ideally, that's what you want. We can try a full separation strategy. Usually we have to establish this when we're building the building. So we're going to separate the building into divisions. And we're going to acknowledge that, we're going to try to contain the damage to one of those divisions. We're going to lose everything within one of those divisions. We're going to try to make it so it cannot spread to another. So usually we're using masonry firewalls. So we're using block construction here to create firewalls. And then recognizing that any hole that we have in that wall is going to reduce the usefulness, and that means that you don't really have a fire division. In terms of outdoors, maybe you've got building complexes and you don't want to lose the whole complex with multiple buildings. Then you need outdoor clear space. And that space has to be clear of all combustibles. So no trees. That's the idea. The space has to be clear. On the very opposite other end, if you've got tiny items that are valuable, then you can think about putting those into a vault or into a safe to prevent fire damage. But again, you're limited by time. Nothing is fully fireproof. So the best we can do is limit it and promise fire protection for a certain amount of time. And that's the best we can do there. Anytime you can substitute non-combustible things, that's going to reduce your risk for fire. And when you're building things, that means choosing block construction over wood construction. As far as the property that fills in the building, if I run a hardware store, I can't only sell non-flammable inventory. There's just nothing I can do about that. The stuff I sell is flammable. And, some of it maybe isn't. And nuts and bolts and things like that, I suppose, really aren't, or they're more fire resistant. But other things that I sell are flammable, and there's nothing I can do. I really don't have any substitutes for that. We talked about hotels and hospitals on the bedding side. They can choose non-flammable options. And a lot of times they will, particularly at the construction stage when you can think about these things. But even if you're not at the construction stage, you could replace all your bedding. It's just that that's an investment to do so. And so that's a big thing that people have to think about. So yeah, to the extent that you can make these choices, you can reduce your fire risk. But again, most of the time you're looking at the building stage. It's very difficult to change these things. I mean, again, ordinary property, there's not much you can do about. What about deliberate fire setting, arson? Well, you got two different groups of people who are doing this. You've got people who are committing crimes against property, and then you have the property owner potentially destroying their own property. There's not a lot you can do about that. But as far as other people, here's some of the things you can do. Yeah, you can have locks on exterior gates. You can have guards. Some places do. And then alarms. That'll reduce forcible entry. And then as far as actually fighting fires itself, sprinklers and fire alarms, those do things to reduce the amount of time that somebody setting a fire would have to work without interruption. That's really the goal that we're trying to establish here. If somebody's going to set our property on fire, we need to do something to make them stop. And so, yeah, you can have other people patrolling the property. You can have guards. Other than that, you've got to have alarms. You've got to have lights. You've got to have ways that draw attention to people who are on your property when they're not supposed to be there. One thing that doesn't work, cameras. Cameras won't reduce arson. They'll help you catch the person who did it. But that's not going to reduce the property damage in the first place. I remember very clearly we had a burglary at our hardware store, and that was a strange occurrence. I was surprised at how I felt about that. It was an emotional thing, and I really felt the word was violated because somebody had broken into our place of business and made a huge mess and took a bunch of stuff. But it was the disrespect for the property that really rankled, and that really hurt me. Anyway, so the police come out to take a report, and it's the same thing. They say, well, what are you trying to do? Are you trying to make it so that this doesn't happen again? Or are you trying to make it so you catch the person? Those are two different things. If you want to catch somebody, then a security camera system will do well, but it isn't going to stop them from doing what they came to do. If you want to stop them, then alarms, that's what you need. Lights, things that prevent it in the first place. And it's the same thing with arson. What about actually putting fires out? So here we're assuming everybody's acting rationally. You've got internal and external ways to reduce fire. Internal is things that happen on your property to extinguish fires. You're looking at sprinklers and extinguishers. External, well, then you're relying on the fire department, and the key variable there is always going to be distance, number one. And number two, this is probably more important, relationship with the fire department. Do they know your building? How's it laid out? How are they going to get in if it's after hours? Do they know where the fire extinguisher methods are in your building? If they're completely flying blind, you're kind of tying their hands a little bit in terms of how quickly they can get the fire under control. But distance is going to be the big factor, is how quickly can they actually get there. And we talked about rating. We've got those 10 different classifications for how far away you are from the fire department, and that's going to affect your insurance premium. When you have internal systems, sprinkler systems, you're either going to have wet pipe or dry pipe. Wet pipe, water's already in the pipe, ready to go. Dry pipe, you got to pump the water up and through. And some of that has to do with climate. If you're in places where the temperature gets below freezing, you got to be a little careful there to be able to use a wet pipe system. You want to make sure that the building freezing, that's a risk that you have to take, not only because it's going to damage your sprinkler system, but if you end up with a burst pipe, you're going to end up with a whole bunch of other damage too. So those are things that you have to be thinking about. We have other big problems. Testing is a big problem. Are you going to test your sprinkler system? Most people don't, for obvious reasons. I mean, you're going to spray water all over the place and cause some damage. Yeah, I'm not really excited about doing that, but if I don't do that, how do I know it's going to work when I need it to? It's a trade-off you got to figure out. Valves can get closed, and if someone's not monitoring that. If they're left closed, then a sprinkler system, you've just disabled the whole thing. As sprinkler systems have been in place for a while, people paint over them, and that can cause problems. And then inadequate water supply, again, that gets back to testing. Have you really tested your sprinkler system? Do you know that it works? That's a tough thing to try to plan for. It doesn't have to be water. We can use, remember, we're trying to deprive the fire of oxygen, and water will do that. But certain types of fire, water actually spreads, grease fires, right? So a lot of times we'll have dry chemicals that we can use for flammable liquids, and for electrical hazards, you don't want to be using water to fight electrical hazards because water conducts current. So that can be dangerous. When you have a dry chemical system, that's just going to drop dry chemicals on the fire itself and attempt to smother. That's great, but if it's dry, it's going to leave residue. And so that's going to, just like a sprinkler system leaves water to create additional damage, a dry chemical system leaves residue. That's additional damage that has to be cleaned up somehow. In a restaurant, particularly in the kitchen, they're going to use wet chemical systems because when you're over a cooking surface, you can't leave residue, right? That's going to destroy the cooking surface, make it unsafe to use with food. So wet chemicals is what we're going to use. And here it's mostly a foam system. Again, it can't be water because if you're over a cooking surface, that's probably got oil or grease, and water and oil and grease don't mix. You end up spreading fire when you try to dump water on an oil fire. So you got to smother it, and you got to do that with a chemical system, and it's usually got to be a wet chemical system because you've got to avoid leaving residue. And then what that chemical system really is doing is separating the oxygen from the fuel, and it'll extinguish the fire that way. There's been an awful lot of science, an awful lot of experimentation has gone into how do you extinguish fire in a multitude of different ways. And these are just some of the ways that the average person wouldn't think of unless you're in this type of business. We've got other types of chemical systems. We've got carbon dioxide systems. So these are interesting. We're going to flood the air with carbon dioxide. We're going to push out the oxygen. We're going to choke off the fire. But if you've got venting in the room, that won't work. And number two, you can't have people in the room. If you drive all the oxygen out of the room or you displace oxygen, you got people in the room, they aren't going to be able to breathe. Obviously, that's a big deal. So if that's your system, that's great. But then you have to have a separate system to let people know it's not safe to be here. You got to get out. So you can see that that's a big disadvantage to using this type of system, and we're only going to use it in situations where this is our best alternative. And then we have to build in the warning system to let the people know, hey, this extinguishment system is going to go off and it's not safe for you to be here. Halon systems it does the same thing. It drives the oxygen away, but with a mix of agents, not just carbon dioxide. So it might be a little bit safer for people. The problem with halon is back in the 80s in particular, we were worried about ozone depletion. And that was a chemical compound that was shown to destroy ozone because that's what it does. It gets oxygen out of the way. And that's what ozone is primarily oxygen. So an overwhelming use of halon was considered an environmental risk. And so we stopped producing that. And now you don't find a whole lot of those systems still in use. Where you do, they're older. A new building wouldn't use a system like that anymore. What about detection and signaling to let people know, hey, there's a fire here? Well, I mean, we have really simple ways to do this. I mean, you can get a smoke alarm for $10, right? The problem is you got to maintain these. And these systems can alert somebody locally, maybe somebody who's at a guard station. Hey, we got a fire in building 3, or we got smoke in building 3. Whatever, we can send somebody over to check it out. Or if it's just a single building and there are no people there at night, you could have it go directly to the fire department. Alarms that are wired in directly to the fire department are a little bit of a problem because of the number of false alarms that we see. Fire departments don't like getting called out for nothing for 2 reasons. Number one, it's a waste of time, but the bigger problem is the opportunity cost. While they're out responding to your fake alarm, or false alarm, they can't respond to a real one. And that's deeply concerning when that happens. So you're seeing a reluctance from fire departments to allow people to alert them directly. You could have a central station. Maybe I've got 5 different complexes and I've got a security station, and that's where all my signaling systems are going to report to. That might make sense depending on the type of business that you've got. Or we might use something that's entirely our own, a proprietary system. There's a whole bunch of different ways to do that, but the idea here is we're signaling that, hey, there's a problem. This isn't limited to fire. Temperature systems are like this too. You might have inventory that has to be kept at a certain temperature range, and if your refrigeration fails, it's real simple. You got a thermometer, and if it gets above a certain temperature, we got to let somebody know because we got a problem, and all that inventory can spoil. So that's an example of the same type of system with a risk other than fire. As far as fire extinguishers, this is really a Band-Aid measure. This is a first aid measure. If you can catch a fire, you happen to be there right when it starts, great, you might be able to grab a fire extinguisher and use it. But it has to be accessible. People have to know where they are. It has to be visible. And then it's got to be maintained. OSHA guidelines are going to say you have to inspect your fire extinguishers and test them every year. That's law. But there's a lot of places that when you're running a business, there's a million things to do. And this is just one of them. Making sure your fire extinguishers are kept up to date. That's expecting a lot to make sure that everybody does that, even though it's the law. We have 4 different classes of fire extinguishers for different types of fires. If you're going to try to have an extinguisher system in a high-rise building, you have to think about how are you actually going to get the water up to the highest floor. Gravity is just working against you there just by how far up you got to go. So you'll have to have a standpipe system in your building, and that's just to drive the water to be able to deliver it to the top floors where it's needed. Again, we talk about having guard services. If you've got a big enough operation and it actually makes sense to have a security guard patrolling, that can reduce your risk of fire. The idea is they'll be there if something happens, they'll be able to respond, and maybe they'll be able to put the fire out themselves. So you want to give them the tools to do that in the form of a lot of fire extinguishers and easily available. It doesn't do you any good if the nearest fire extinguisher is 3 floors away. By the time you get there and get back, it's going to be out of control. You're going to need the fire department at that point anyway. Speaking of the fire department, that's external fire departments. And again, how far away you are is the most important thing. Cooperating with fire department ahead of time is really important. Maybe you've just got a basic pole building. All right, we don't need a whole lot of conversation to talk about where are the important things stored. If your building is complicated at all, if it's difficult to get around for the uninitiated, you're going to want to make sure that you have good, close cooperation with your fire department. So when you need them, they know what your building looks like. And they can get to where they need to get as quickly as they need to get there. And they're not fumbling around in the dark looking for valves and things like that. That's just going to make the fire worse. So yeah, distance is important. Having the fire department familiar with your property is as important. Once you have fire damage, you're going to have water damage. And so what can you do to reduce water damage? Well, whatever you can do to drain, have good drainage systems in construction, thinking about, all right, if the sprinklers go off, if the fire department comes in here shooting gallons of water through a hose, we're going to get water all over the place. That's going to damage stuff. How can we drain and minimize the flooding damage? That's really what it ends up being. Another thing to think about, keep materials off the floor to the extent that you can. Your shelving systems, don't rest that bottom shelf on the floor. Elevate it a little bit. It won't help you with the sprayed water, but it'll help you with the standing water, particularly in conjunction with a good draining system. And then, give some thought to the products that you have that are most damaged by water. Can you keep them somewhere off the bottom floor and off the lowest level of your shelving? Whatever you can do there will help control water damage. And these are all things that you need to think about when you have an empty building. That's the appropriate time to be making these kinds of plans. It's extremely hard to do this on the fly. After you have a fire, what can you still sell? You might have inventory that was fire damaged. We had our hardware store go through a fire in 1989. A lot of our inventory was still good. Nuts and bolts don't get destroyed by fire, but they are dirtied up, and some of them had been sitting in water for a little bit. So some of them are a little rusted. So maybe that means that those particular parts won't work for every project, but for some projects they will. And so for a very long time, we had tables out for fire damaged materials that we sold at incredible discounts because we just didn't want to throw it away. So it was just, does this have any use? Put it on a table, stick a price on it. Maybe it's 25% of retail. Somebody will take it and say that's worth doing. And in the process, that's salvage. We're cutting our losses from the fire. As far as not being able to operate, again, ahead of time, it makes sense to think about, well, what are you going to do if a fire put you out of business for 2 weeks? Would you try to reopen somewhere? Having a standby plan makes sense. Another thing that might surprise you, but it's true, cooperating with your competitors. All right. You're in the same business. You have a lot of similar interests, and you're not always rooting for them to fail. Right. Okay. So we're in the propane business. It's actually not a good thing for us if our biggest competitor goes out of business in the middle of winter. You might say, oh, that's great for you. Think of all the additional customers you're going to get. We can't serve them all. We don't have the capacity. We don't have enough trucks. We don't have enough tanks. We don't have enough people working for us. It's not good for our community if our competitors go out of business suddenly. Yeah, we're competitors. We compete, but that doesn't mean that we don't have certain interests in common. And this is one of them. It's actually in our best interest to try to help our competitors survive. Unless we have enough time to plan a takeover, then you might have a different strategy. But most of the time when you're talking about things like this, fires and unexpected events, you are not in a position to simply absorb all of their customers. You probably don't have the capacity to do it. And so it's worth thinking about reaching out a helping hand. That is something that goes a long way in a small community. And yeah, your competitors, but after you help them out, they're not going to aggressively go after trying to take your customers either. And you start to realize that, hey, we're all in this together and we need each other. It's an interesting situation to go through to start to look at it that way. And it kind of changes how you think about business. Anyway, didn't want to get too far off the subject there, but cooperating with your competitors, you'd be surprised at how often that's actually a valuable thing to do. Okay, that's a good place to insert a break here because moving on to theft is a little bit different. So we'll take a break right here. We'll pick up with theft on the next lecture. If you have questions, let me know by email and I'll do the best I can to answer. Thanks a lot, you guys.